I knew it was going to be another one of those nights the moment Amber walked through the door. Her nose was crinkled, lips pursed into a tight frown, as if she'd caught a whiff of something foul. I tried to ignore the judgmental glances she shot my way as I bustled around the kitchen, putting the final touches on dinner. "Glenda, darling, you've outdone yourself as always," Harlan said, kissing me on the cheek. At least someone appreciated my efforts. "Mom, the pot roast smells amazing," Ethan chimed in, giving me a warm hug. Amber simply scowled and muttered under her breath, "If you say so." We settled around the dining table, and an awkward silence fell over us as we began eating. I could feel Amber's eyes boring into me, sizing up each bite with disdain. The pot roast, a family recipe using the cheapest cut of meat, was worlds away from the fancy fare she'd become accustomed to at overpriced Manhattan eateries. "So, how was everyone's day?" I asked, desperate to break the tension. Ethan launched into a story about the hilariously inept new intern at his office, but Amber didn't so much as crack a smile. She simply pushed the food around her plate, every so often shooting me a look that could curdle milk. My efforts to make pleasant conversation died on the vine as Amber's displeasure became more and more palpable. By the time we finished eating, the atmosphere had grown so frosty you could hang meat in it. "Well, that was just dreadful," Amber said, making no attempt to mask her contempt as she rose from the table. "I'm going to call Francesca and see if she grabbed a table at that new tapas place." She stormed off to make her call, leaving me to clean up yet another mess, literally and figuratively. As I scraped the remains of my labor of love into the trash, I couldn't help but overhear her conversation floating in from the living room. "Yes, it was just pedestrian slop as usual from Glenda," she sneered in a mocking tone. "I told Ethan he needs to get me cooking lessons for my birthday because I simply cannot survive on such unsophisticated, mediocre fare." Her callous words twisted like a knife in my heart. But in that moment, the sting of her insult ignited something within me. A simmering defiance, a refusal to simply take her abuse lying down any longer. Amber's condescending ways had gone too far for too long. If it was fancy food she wanted, I vowed, fancy food she would get. One way or another, I would expose her snobbish charade for all to see. I could feel Amber's smug gaze burning into the back of my head as I tapped my foot impatiently in the long line at Boulangerie Sublime. This trendy little bakery was all the rage, their decadent desserts coating the lips of every Upper East Side socialite. And of course, it was Amber's new obsession du jour. I simply must have the Grand Marnier soufflé for my book club meeting, she had demanded that morning while scanning reviews on her iPad. The ladies will surely be impressed. Getting my hands on one of those coveted soufflés wasn't going to be easy, though. The bakery's limited quantities sparked a daily stampede, with customers queuing up before dawn like they were vying for Coachella tickets. But Amber's whims were not to be denied. "Don't forget, you need to get there right when they open at 8 a.m., she instructed with an air of smug superiority. "They always sell out before noon." As if I didn't already have enough to do getting ready for her pretentious book club, squeezing in this errand was going to be a major pain. But I knew better than to argue with Her Royal Highness. After jostling my way through the throngs of line waiters for over an hour, I was finally ushered inside the bakery. My hopes were immediately dashed as the snooty clerk shook his head in disdain. "We're all out of the soufflés, I'm afraid," he announced with an uppity French lilt. "You'll have to come back first thing tomorrow." My face flushed with embarrassment as the other customers openly mocked my futile errand. "Seriously, lady? Did you expect to waltz in at 9:15 and snag one?" A nasally woman clucked from behind me. Dejected, I trudged back home, dreading Amber's reaction to my failure. Sure enough, when I walked through the door, she was waiting in the kitchen with her signature sneer. "Well?" she demanded imperiously. "Where is my soufflé?" "But they were all out by the time I got there," I stammered, bracing for her wrath. "Are you kidding me?" she exploded, her face contorting into a mask of rage. "You had one simple task. How could you possibly mess that up?" She ranted and raged for what felt like an eternity, her insults growing more vicious and demeaning by the minute. All the while, I just stood there and took it, burning with humiliation and resentment. "I swear, Glenda, sometimes your incompetence is staggering," she spat. You're useless, an utter failure. Those hateful words detonated something deep inside me, igniting a fury I could no longer contain. In that volatile moment, my desire to appease this vile woman evaporated like smoke. She wanted to see just how much of an utter failure I could be. Message received, Amber. Game on. Over the next few days, Amber's scathing treatment of me continued unabated behind closed doors. But the moment Ethan or Harlan were around, her demeanor underwent a striking transformation. Glenda, darling, I simply can't get enough of your cooking. She would gush with saccharine sweetness while patting my hand. Everything you make is just sublime. The compliments dripped like hot wax from her lying lips. I could hardly believe this was the same woman who had berated me as a hopeless failure just hours earlier. Ethan, ever the naive one, just beamed with pride at his wife's supposed appreciation for my culinary talents. That's my Glenda, he would chuckle, pulling me in for an affectionate hug. A regular Julia child, isn't she? If only he knew the truth about the venom Amber spewed behind his back. How she ridiculed and denigrated everything and everyone she perceived as beneath her cultivated airs. No one was spared her snide condemnation, not even her own family. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen whipping up a batch of my famous oatmeal chocolate chip cookies, a treasured family recipe using basic, inexpensive ingredients. Amber came sweeping in, wrinkling her nose at the homey aromas. Good Lord, Glenda, you're not serving those pedestrian monstrosities at the charity luncheon, are you? She sneered with undisguised revulsion. I felt my cheeks flush with humiliation and outrage. But before I could respond, Ethan strolled in, and her scowl instantly morphed into a brilliant smile. Those cookies smell delightful, mother-in-law, she chirped in a sickly sweet tone. Just like from a gourmet bakery. The ladies will go wild for them, I'm sure. Ethan just chuckled obliviously as he snatched a cookie off the tray, cramming it into his mouth. Yup, these are the greatest, he mumbled through a mouthful of crumbs. You've really outdone yourself this time, Mom. It was all I could do to keep from hurling the tray across the room. This two-faced, malicious behavior from Amber was becoming more than I could bear. My own son was so blind to her true, vicious nature that my heart ached for him. Later, after Ethan had left for work, I confronted Amber about her abhorrent double act. Why must you insult me and put down my cooking 1 minute, then turn around and sweetly praise it the next? I demanded, my voice trembling with pent-up emotion. She simply shrugged and rolled her eyes at my wounded indignation. Please, Glenda, don't be so sensitive, she scoffed coldly. I'm just looking out for Ethan's best interests. He doesn't need his oafish mother serving up bargain basement swill and embarrassing him in front of his colleagues and friends. The cruel arrogance in her tone crystallized my determination right then and there. Enough was enough. It was time for this two-faced witch to get her comeuppance once and for all, and I would be the one to serve it up to her on a silver platter. With Amber's callous words still ringing in my ears, I started hatching a plan to finally expose her two-faced behavior. The next Sunday, I was hosting the whole family for a big dinner, the perfect opportunity to set my trap. As I busied myself in the kitchen prepping the meal, I made sure to utilize only the simplest, most basic ingredients, the kinds of bargain basement fare Amber openly mocked. Pork shoulder from the supermarket budget bin. Potatoes, carrots, and onions straight from the local produce stand. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, just humble, home-cooked goodness. When Amber arrived with Ethan and Harlan in tow, her eyes immediately narrowed with disdain at the rustic aromas wafting from the kitchen. What is that smell? She wrinkled her nose. It better not be another one of your tragic downscale meals, Glenda. Actually, it's a very special dish I've been working on, I replied with a sly grin, but you'll just have to wait and see. Amber's signature scowl told me all I needed to know. The bait had been taken. As we gathered around the table to eat, I made sure to pile Amber's plate high with the humble fixings, much to her obvious disgust. She poked and prodded the food with her fork, grimacing. Well, are you going to at least try it? I asked innocently. Amber flashed a sour glance at Ethan and Harlan, both of whom were already wolfing down their portions with obvious enjoyment. Reluctantly, she raised a forkful of the pot roast to her pursed lips. This looks dreadfully rustic, she proclaimed with obvious disdain. but I suppose I can choke it down, for Ethan's sake. I held my breath as she took her first tentative bite, bracing for the inevitable torrent of disparaging comments. But it never came. Instead, her eyes went wide with surprise as she slowly chewed and swallowed. Actually, this isn't half bad, she admitted grudgingly after a pause. The flavors are quite robust, I'd say. Buoyed by that small victory, Amber soon began shoveling the food down with almost rabid gusto, grunting with approval between ravenous bites. Ethan and Harlan looked on in pleased bemusement, no doubt shocked by her uncharacteristic zeal for my rustic home cooking. "Glenda, this may be the best dish you've ever prepared," she effused, mopping up the last of the gravy with a slice of bread. "You've clearly outdone yourself this time. Why, I'd wager this swill could give even those pompous bistros in the city a run for their money." The naked contempt in her tone as she insulted my humble offerings sent a hot flash of anger through my body. But I managed to keep my expression impassive, disguising my roiling fury behind a thin smile. "Why, thank you, Amber," I cooed. "I'm so pleased you enjoyed it." Oh, but she would soon eat those smug, condescending words. That's when the true meal would begin. After clearing the dinner plates, I made sure to heap lavish praise on Amber for her apparent newfound appreciation of my home cooking. "I'm so delighted you enjoyed that meal," I gushed, laying it on thick. "Your refined palate clearly recognized the superior quality of those ingredients." Amber just nodded haughtily, lapping up the flattery like a parched cat. "Well, of course I could taste the difference," she preened. "You simply must share where you sourced that exceptional pork and produce." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. Time to set the next phase of my plan into motion. "Actually, those ingredients were nothing special," I replied with a sly grin. "Just picked up at the regular grocery store down the street. But I'm so pleased my preparation skills elevated them to your discerning standards." Amber's brow furrowed with confusion as she processed this admission. But before she could respond, I pressed on with my ruse. "In fact, I've been inspired to take my cooking to even loftier heights," I declared with faux enthusiasm. For our next family dinner, I'm going to prepare a true gourmet feast utilizing only the finest, most premium ingredients money can buy. That piqued Amber's interest, her eyes glittering with avarice. "Do go on," she urged, leaning forward expectantly. "Well, I'm going to start by sourcing some primo beef tenderloin from that elite butcher in the city," I began, relishing every fabricated detail. "The one that supplies all the iconic steakhouses and commands a 3-month waiting list just to get a prime cut." Amber was practically salivating at this point, hanging on my every word. Ethan and Harlan just exchanged bemused glances, clearly not understanding what had gotten into me. Then for the produce, I'm thinking of flying in some heirloom varieties from this acclaimed farm in Tuscany that Michelin chefs are raving about, I went on breathlessly. Of course, I'll need to track down some creme de la creme dairy products too, butter from an artisanal creamery, that sort of thing. "Glenda, this all sounds marvelous," Amber gushed, fanning herself. "A true Epicurean adventure. You simply must let me assist in sourcing these world-class delicacies." I shook my head, reveling in her transparent eagerness to indulge her snobbish Epicurean fantasies. "Oh no, my dear, I insist on handling every detail myself as a surprise for my treasured family." Little did she know, the real surprise was yet to come. As the evening drew to a close and our guests prepared to depart, Amber pulled me aside with ill-disguised glee twinkling in her eyes. "I can't wait to savor your culinary masterpiece at the next gathering, Glenda," she purred. "It's about time your talents are put towards more elevated ends." With a wink, she turned and sashayed out, utterly clueless of the role she would soon be playing in my delicious come-uppance. This was gonna be good. The big night had finally arrived. Amber swept into the dining room, her nose already wrinkling disdainfully at the simple table setting. "Really, Glenda? This rustic decor?" she tutted, running a manicured finger along the plain linen tablecloth. "For the lavish spread you've been boasting about, I expected something a bit more elegant." I suppressed a smirk as I bustled out carrying a silver serving dish. "Don't worry, dear, the true elegance is what's underneath this cover." I slowly lifted the lid with a flourish, revealing a thick, juicy tenderloin roast glistening with a rich demi-glace. Amber's eyes grew wide as saucers, greed and gluttony etched across her features. "Is that—" she gasped, practically panting. "Why, yes, the much-hyped beef from that world-renowned butcher in Manhattan," I proclaimed with feigned nonchalance. "The one with the 3-month waiting list, as I mentioned." Amber's eyes fluttered with rapture as she leaned over to inhale the heady aroma. "Glenda, it's magnificent. I can practically taste the decadence already." She fairly swayed on the spot like a debutante recovering from the vapors, as I set the dish down in front of her with a ceremonious flourish. The other platters I paraded out in succession only heightened her delirious anticipation. "And these," I announced with a wave of my hand, "petite potatoes cultivated from an elite farm in the French countryside that supplies 3-star Michelin chefs. Hand-delivered yesterday by a master gardener after a months-long germination process." That was complete hogwash, of course. I'd picked those russets up from the supermarket bargain bin just like always. But Amber hungrily gobbled up every word, nodding feverishly all the while. Finally, I presented the pièce de résistance, an exquisite cheesecake drizzled with an emerald mint glaze. Behold, New York's most elite dairy purveyor's smoothest triple cream chèvre, accented with sun-ripened strawberries flown in fresh this morning from a boutique farm in Provence, I breathlessly described with a completely straight face. In reality, it was just a standard supermarket cheesecake doctored up with some mint extract and strawberry jam from my pantry. But Amber was utterly transfixed, borderline comatose with avarice as she fixated on every imagined delicacy before her. "Glenda, I'm speechless," she finally gasped, clutching a trembling hand to her hollow bosom. "This opulent feast it's too much. You've truly outdone yourself." Ethan and Harlan just gawked in stunned silence, clearly wondering what had gotten into me with all this bombastic overselling. Little did they know it was all a grand setup for Amber's looming humiliation. No sooner had we dug into the very first course than Amber began to moan and groan with rapturous delight, showering me with breathless compliments between every decadent bite. "This beef is a transgressive experience, Glenda, a spiritual awakening in every velvety morsel." It went on and on like that through each successive dish. By dessert, she was practically swooning, scraping up every last crumb and licking her plate clean. "Best meal I've ever had, anywhere," she raved, practically in a fugue state. "You've ruined me for all other food." I just smiled thinly and thanked her as Ethan and Harlan exchanged bewildered shrugs. But inside I was grinning wide in gleeful anticipation. The trap had been perfectly sprung. Now for the final, delicious sting. As Amber sat back with a contented sigh, gently patting her stuffed belly, I decided to strike while the iron was hot. "So, I take it you enjoyed this little culinary adventure?" I asked innocently, trying not to let my grin show too much smug satisfaction. "Enjoyed it? That doesn't even begin to describe it." Amber gushed, her eyes glazed over in a dreamy trance. This was a full-body experience that transcended mere sustenance. Every bite was a finely crafted masterwork to be savored and contemplated. Ethan and Harlan shot each other confused looks, clearly baffled by her overblown outpouring of praise. Bless their hearts, they had no clue what a charade this entire evening had been. "Well, I'm overjoyed my efforts met with your discerning approval," I replied with a sly smile. "Though I must admit, I simply couldn't have pulled off such an Epicurean tour de force without your invaluable guidance." Amber blinked slowly, her brow furrowing. "My guidance? What do you mean?" Ooh, this was going to be delicious. "Why, your constant insistence on only the finest, most elite ingredients, of course," I exclaimed with mock innocence. "You've trained my palate to reject anything less than the utmost in culinary perfection." I could see the dawning look of baffled realization creeping across Amber's face as I drove the knife deeper. "Take this beef tenderloin, for instance," I went on breezily. "You made it quite clear that only the most luxurious, world-class cut would pass muster with your refined tastes. So, of course, I had to source it from that impossible boutique butcher you're always raving about." Amber's mouth worked silently as she processed my words, panic flashing in her eyes, but I kept piling it on ruthlessly. "And the produce? Well, you've hammered home time and again how pedestrian American crops simply wouldn't do for a true gourmand like yourself. So naturally, I had to go the extra mile obtaining these French and Italian delicacies flown in from your preferred purveyors overseas." By this point, Amber's face had drained of all color, giving her a sickly pallor. She flicked a terrified glance over at Ethan and Harlan, seeing the first cracks in her facade forming. That's not... You've got it all wrong, she sputtered desperately. But I was just getting warmed up, ready to put the killing stroke on this whole rotten charade of hers once and for all. Oh, and this cheesecake, I crowed, barely able to contain my delight. You certainly gave me an education on why no ordinary cream cheese would suffice. Only the organic, artisanal triple cream from that snobby little Madison Avenue fromagerie could possibly meet your lofty standards. Amber opened and closed her mouth wordlessly, utterly at a loss as the entire web of lies she'd spun unraveled around her. Ethan and Harlan's dumbstruck expressions revealed the veil had finally been lifted on the disdainful elitist monster they'd married into the family. I took a deep breath, steadying myself to deliver the coup de grace. Which is why, I announced in a tone dripping with sugary faux sweetness, I wanted to sincerely thank you, Amber, for inspiring me to put all my skills and effort into this sumptuous high society repast. I gestured grandly at the plates of half-eaten food surrounding us, each course prepared from the plainest, most basic supermarket provisions money could buy. A gourmet masterpiece, you called it, fit for the most refined of culinary queens, when really it was nothing more than my typical bargain basement home cooking dressed up in fancy airs. The penny finally dropped for Amber as her face contorted with impotent rage and humiliation. Her menu of deceit had finally been laid bare, and the main dish was an extra-large serving of cold, harsh truth. Game, set, and match, courtesy of this fed-up mother-in-law. The aftermath of my grand unmasking played out like a shipwreck in extreme slow motion. Amber's face contorted through a gamut of emotions, shock, anger, shame, desperation, as the truth of her deception sank in. You conniving old witch, she finally sputtered, eyes bulging with outrage. How dare you try to humiliate me like this in front of my husband? Ethan sat in stunned silence, his expression unrateable as his wife's cringeworthy facade crumbled before his eyes. Harlan, on the other hand, looked like he was trying not to bust a gut laughing. Amber, honey, I think the only one doing any humiliating here is you, he chuckled, shooting me an approving wink. This was just a long overdue reality check. Reality? You want to talk reality? Amber raged, rounding on my poor clueless son. Wake up and smell the green juice, Ethan. Your quaint little mama and her down-market home ec skills don't belong in this century, let alone our social sphere. As those hateful words sliced through the air, something shifted in Ethan's face. The rose-tinted scales of denial seemed to fall away as he finally got an unfiltered look at the poisonous snake he'd married. That's enough, he said quietly, raising a hand to silence Amber's tirade. I've heard more than enough out of you tonight. Amber froze, her mouth hanging open in gobsmacked shock. She clearly wasn't accustomed to Ethan going against her arrogant diktats. But darling, you can't be serious, she sputtered incredulously. You're really going to take the word of this spiteful old troll over your own wife? Ethan's jaw tightened as he rose to his feet, anger flashing in his eyes. Maybe if my wife had been an honest, loyal partner, instead of a lying, materialistic snob, I wouldn't have to make that choice. The air fairly crackled with tension as Amber's shrill scoffing filled the room. Well, I can certainly see where your true priorities lie, Ethan Morris, with the help in their downscale ways, apparently. She shot me one last murderous glare before snatching up her purse and storming towards the door. Don't worry, I know when I'm not wanted, she hurled over her shoulder. Have fun playing house with Mummykins and her pathetic home cooking. I deserve better than this poverty-class charade. The slamming of the front door behind her echoed through the stunned silence that followed. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, head bowed, as the gravity of this marital rupture washed over him. At last he raised his gaze to meet mine, a lifetime of pent-up hurt and frustration shining in his eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You were right all along about Amber. I was just too blind and dazzled to see the truth. In that moment, I felt the icy knot of resentment that had taken root in my heart all those years began to thaw and dissolve. My son had been lost, true, but now, finally, he had found his way home. As I pulled Ethan into a fierce, forgiving embrace, I knew our family had been irrevocably broken, but not beyond repair. We would pick up the pieces, slowly healing the rifts that Amber's greed and cruelty had torn open through our unconditional love and stubborn decency. And this time there would be no snobby pretenses or polite fictions masking the truth. Just the honest bonds of this mother and son duo firmly intact, sharing good food, good company, and stubborn determination to always keep it real, no matter how ugly.